First, a conversation just about how artists think about the work that we're doing. What frameworks, what words, what images can we use to help us understand and think about the role that artists play in communities. And then I want to share with you a framework that emerged from this Acting Together project called The Moral Imagination. It actually comes from a peace builder named John Paul Lederach, and see if it resonates with you about another way, another kind of lens to use to look at the work that we're doing. And then finally some thoughts about reconciliation itself. So there's an American poet named Adrienne Rich, many of you may have heard of her, who described the relationship between art and society in this way. That there's a permeable membrane between art and society, a continuous dialectical motion. Tides brining the estuary, a river flowing into the sea. Likewise, the matter of art enters the bloodstream of social energy. And one of the things that Adrienne Rich says is that you can't really ever know the impact of art in society. It's like the artistic gesture, the effort is made, it goes out into society, and we can't really ever know for sure how the transformation happens. And there's something I think that artists will recognize is very true about that we do our best work with artistic integrity, and then we trust that those who are involved or witness the work carry something into society with them. This work here that you see is a lino cut by students of Stampe Salibe in Johannesburg in South Africa. Students learning to do this work went out into their communities and asked their grandparents about the meaning of Ubuntu, which is a South African construct meaning I am a human being because you are a human being. We are interdependent. They told their stories, then collaborated together in creating a whole set of images about the meaning of interdependence in their communities. But this idea of the artistic gesture and its integrity just being in communities and having its effect kind of bumps up against another imperative I think we feel as people wanting to use the arts in changing society, which is, how do we know if it's working? How do we know that what we're doing is actually moving towards the kind of society that we really want and is creating change? And from the peace building field, a woman actually lives in Cambridge, Mass, near where I live, near Boston. Mary Anderson gathered a lot of peace builders together to ask this question, because peace builders have the same problem. How do we know what we're doing is working? And she says, how do we know that the work for peace is worthwhile? How do we do what we do better, with more effect, with better effect? What are the results of our work for the people on whose behalf or with whom we work? So I think as a lot of artists working for social change because of funders and the imperatives of having documentation for their next grant want to be able to say, well, what's the impact? But more than that, we want to really know, like, are we having the kind of quality of, are we making the kind of changes that we really want to be making? And so this is kind of a tension point that I think it's interesting to sit with, and that we've been working with in the Acting Together on the World Stage project. How do we honor the artistic integrity of the work and also think about how our work is affecting society? What kind of documentation can we do? What kind of measures, if you want to use that word? I want to say a little bit about this notion of post-conflict, which I think most people agree really is kind of not that helpful of a term, because in fact we're always in conflict. And conflict is really in itself not a bad thing, right? Conflict is what life is about. It's about different ideas, different needs, different values coming into relationship, and it's what creates growth. The problem isn't conflict. The problem is violence. The problem is pursuing our different needs and interests in a way that injures the other party. And it's interesting that we have even come to think of conflict as being so negative, because most times conflicts are pursued so badly. So I like to think about rather this notion of the arts being able to contribute to more just and less violent communities when it's in the aftermath of violence, when it's in the midst of violence, and when it's in context of structural violence, poverty and oppression and that sort of thing, and repression. So, and in fact, any community pretty much is in all three of those three states at the same time. This is a very beginning list of things that performances can do in conflict settings. And it's, as you skim down this list, it's a lot about connectivity. It's about connecting the heart with the mind, about connecting individuals to their communities, about bridging communities with each other, connecting the global and the local. And in performance in particular, embodying, not just thinking about, not just looking at, but actually embodying power that's creative, nonviolent, respectful, and transformative. Now, not all art works for the good, and I want to say that. So that's why I've consciously said here that performances can be crafted. It's not that automatically they do. Which of these projects do you connect to? Do you find inspiration from? Do you think might inform work that you would do in the future, perhaps?
Mi visto en la parte más alta de la montaña y he comprendido todo. Y mirando mi pueblo por última vez he dicho, adiós, alegría, adiós.
La señora me dijo, usted es la escultura que ha estado trabajando, ¿no? Su historia es verdad, pero también es muy bella. Entonces esta mujer me empezó a contar lo que le había pasado en la guerra. Una noche que ella estaba con sus hijas en la comunidad y entró el ejército disparando y se metieron debajo de la cama y ellas simplemente tampoco podían gritar, porque si ellas gritaban entraban a la casa. Me contó su historia porque no fue a la Comisión de la Verdad a contar, porque tenía miedo, pero el teatro hizo posible que ella se liberara de ese dolor tan terrible. Es un momento importante que de repente tú descubres de que tu trabajo tiene sentido.
put a knife through that and cut it open. And once audiences, think about it, then their own thinking is activated.
When we think about peace building, the arts can do a lot of different things. They engage our imagination so that new ideas and new concepts can emerge where we don't necessarily have language yet. They provide a context for engaging conflict in a productive way. So even those people who we've thought of as completely different and other and enemies, we can begin to see as human beings. That's why I think artists have a lot to offer to the work of peace building, even more than they do already.
I think that peace builders have a goal. Peace. And rightfully, in pursuit of that goal, they set strategy. The artists don't work that way. The potential for beautiful revelation lies in not knowing the goal, but believing that as artists we have a capacity to assimilate our experiences in a revelatory way that we cannot predict.
It was forbidden to speak publicly that we were in the war. We started to hear about horrors committed by our government, stories about paramilitary troops. People felt being like schizophrenics because they were hearing the stories, but on the other hand, publicly it was total denial. How to oppose the violence if you don't want to become violent yourself. From the beginning for us was very clear, very concretely clear. We can oppose it through creating the sense for people. The response of the audience was enormous. For the first time they heard publicly what they knew and what they felt. We had the public voice. And I believe that we should work always from our personal needs. But then when that need is organically connected to the need of your community, or I use the Greek word polis, then I think something real transformative happens.
I wouldn't say give voice. I would say offer a critical vision and encouragement to people. The people have their own voice.
Y necesitamos también crear un público y formar un público así, que no sea simplemente pasivo. Queremos un público activo que sea capaz de sentirse protagonista de la historia que está viendo.
Very complicated things that you don't necessarily talk about every day should suddenly become part of the conversation, and all that material entered into the play. The end result is you see 13 men from 7 different cultures, Muslim, Christian, talking about their lives and interacting and showing themselves at a level of vulnerability that you never see these men, who in the media are always amorphous, superficial, stereotyped figures.
New forms of art, new forms of theater are created because it's being created with the people there about things that matter to them, plays an important role in social transformation in that sense.
There are theatrical dilemmas, and there are peace-building dilemmas, and there are ethical dilemmas that are shared by both fields. I think one theatrical dilemma has to do with the aesthetic, whether the use or the utilization of theater for a very, very clear social or political purpose is even legitimate. That's a dilemma.
The other very dangerous aspect is to actually do work that is very mediocre in quality and not given its right time to be digested, processed, and be ready to be offered to an audience. There are not too many places where we can come together to learn this work.
Witnessing the stories that my parents have told me, it just brings a chill to me to do this play and to realize that things like this happens not only in my family but in other families too.
Look, could you see me?
No, my eyes are weak. They blindfolded me for a long time. Suddenly they took off the blindfold and took my photo. Who are you?
A photograph on the wall.
The reason I survived, I would steal food from my neighbor, and I saved my portion for my dad because I realized my dad and I are the only one that left to survive. So that's only a little bit of my story. I pass on to you. Thank you.
In 1935, when the Khmer became power,
there's the hope of not wanting to re-traumatize people that have survived genocide. There's also the very, very deep hope of never again. I would like to talk about the idea of remembering as a revolutionary act.
Arts do so many things. They provoke,
they challenge, they soothe, they provide context for conversation and dialogue. That's a really important resource for peace building.
To sage, if you will, these stories, these voices, it will prompt a lot of soul searching, a lot of thinking, and a lot of pain.
Si dijimos, ¿queremos ser artistas o activistas políticos? ¿Qué queremos ser? Mejores seres humanos.
What has that quest for an improved human condition, not just for myself, but for other people?
We be able to create the kinds of spaces where we can immerse ourselves in seeing what is going on right now around us, what is going on right now inside of us, between us.
Is less interested in theater because it's less interested in engagement with the fundamental questions of our lives. All these questions are crucial, essential. We're endangered by not answering them. All of these theater artists refuse to be in denial.
Is there one of these artists whose work really resonates for you, or who you find particular inspiration in? Do you see your own work connected to one of the ways of working that are exemplified in these different performances? I'm going to just share with you this framework of the moral imagination as one way of thinking about what distinguishes peace-building performance from other kinds of performances, or how can we assess performance in its peace-building capacity, coming from this idea that I shared with you from Adrienne Rich about a permeable membrane between art and society. So I'm curious to hear if you think this is a useful framework, or if it connects with you, what you might add to it. Start out by thinking about communities. So communities marked by violence and oppression are filled with absences. They're filled with absences of suppressed truths, untold stories, unmourned losses. I felt this very much in watching the play the other night here. So much of unfulfilled yearnings, unspoken remorse, unrepaired injury, unaddressed injustices, unreconciled relationships, unrecognized humanity. Next slide. So if we think about the space of art as a space within this community that's marked off somehow, and that there's all of these unspoken, unsaid, expressed feelings, thoughts, ideas, somehow come into a creative space through this membrane. In other words, they come from society into the theater space. They come from our world onto the canvas, right? And what is it that they're filtered through? What is this membrane that Adrienne Rich described? I think we could think about, in peace-building performance, that membrane is what peace builders call the moral imagination, right? It's the ability to stay grounded in the real world with its suffering, with its beauty, with its possibilities and its resiliences, but also with its injustices and its poverty and its misunderstandings. To stay grounded in that world at the same time as we're imagining a better world. A healthier, more robust, more beautiful, more vital, more creative world. And this moral imagination requires at its simplest way of description, requires four things, says John Paul Lederach, peace builder. It requires creativity, right? Always thinking in new, creative ways, bringing things into new combination. It requires the willingness to take risk. And paradoxically, the risk can be going from the familiarity of violence to the unfamiliar, unsafe feeling of actually being more vulnerable, more open, and therefore therefore more peaceful. So creativity and risk, and then two other qualities. Always remembering that we are, in fact, interdependent. Whether we acknowledge it or not, the interdependence is there. The well-being of my community depends on the well-being of your community. And the well-being of my grandchildren will depend on the well-being of your grandchildren. We can't necessarily pursue just one community's well-being without the other. And then the last is my favorite, it's the one on top here, paradoxical curiosity, which means the inclination to think about things that could be described as polar opposites, in fact, is somehow existing in the same space. So, thinking in terms of, yes, paradox, that, let's say, actually working towards the future requires remembering the past. The past and the future have to exist somehow in the same space together, as one example. So, next slide. These, yeah, and then the next slide. Sorry, I missed one. So these elements from the community enter into the space of creativity through the ethical and aesthetic sensibilities of the artist and the cultural workers. And next slide, in the creative space, they're transformed there. And then an important question is how then they move back out into the world. And obviously that happens through the minds and the bodies and the relationships of the people who witness the performance, but how else can we, I think a question about effectiveness is how can we amplify the way in which these changes that happen in a performative space do go back out into the world? Are they reaching the people they need to reach? Are they bringing together in audiences and for conversation people who need to be brought into conversation? In the acting together on the world stage, we discovered at least four different ways in which the moral imagination has transformed some elements of conflict, bringing this idea of paradox to play. So resistance can be creative and not merely oppositional. Resistance can be about building capacities and ensuring the humanity and the creativity of the group that has been oppressed. And I think that Iman Aoun, who's here from Palestine, will be perhaps able to share a bit about that in her work later today and tomorrow. Justice can balance both retribution, that is punishment, and accountability with also restoration. So we can have restorative justice and retributive justice working somehow hand in hand. Celebrations of identity can acknowledge interdependence and the rights of individuals. And that past losses can be remembered and dignified in ways that support creating and imagining a new future. So these are questions. So these are some of the things that we learned in looking at a certain set of case studies of performance in different conflict regions. And I guess I'm wondering if this idea resonates for any of you, if you could imagine how you see things being transformed in the performative space, and then how we're able to send those transformations powerfully out into the world. One of the groups that you saw here, Yuachkani from Peru, I think exemplifies some of this in a very strong way for me, that they were able to, because of their years, actually decades of work in the indigenous communities of Peru, they were tapped by a truth commission in Peru to go out into the indigenous communities in advance and through ritual and workshops and performance to prepare the people of the country to actually, these indigenous communities that had been most brutalized by war, by the Civil War, to be able to testify and share their stories. And as you saw here, in some cases, people were able to share their stories with them as performers who were too scared and to be able to testify before the Truth Commission. So I guess maybe we could just take a few minutes and think about, for some of you, which elements of the moral imagination do you find embedded in your work, or that come alive through your work? And if you were going to use this framework to describe your work, how would you think about the way in which things enter into the performative space and the way in which they're transformed there and then the way they go back out into the world? So here I want to do a dangerous thing, which is to propose a framework for thinking about the meaning of reconciliation. And I know that some people like definitions and some people don't, but at the end of the conference last week, some people said, yeah, well, we were talking about peace, we're talking about reconciliation, but we don't even know necessarily what it is that we're even talking about here. So let me propose a particular framework for reconciliation and see if this resonates for you, and give you some examples of how arts of different kinds have actually contributed to different forms of to different aspects of the reconciliatory process. So let's move to the next slide. So here, I think the key notion is about trust. That reconciliation is basically a process of moving from hatred and alienation and mistrust to a situation of reciprocal and warranted trust. Warranted meaning that not only am I trusting, but I'm also trustworthy. And I'm trustworthy not only by intention, but actually in effect, in act. And this is not a timeline, but it's a continuum that looks at the extent to which we acknowledge, we recognize our interdependence with each other. And even though this looks like there's a line, a straight line, it's only my lack of PowerPoint skills that makes it a straight line. It really is a very wiggly line that turns back on itself, because reconciliation is anything but a linear process. Next slide. So reconciliation is about moving from a situation in which we're willing to try to address our needs through actually injuring the other party, through violence, through slavery, apartheid, occupation, to a place where we are meeting our other needs with a sense of mutuality, meeting our own needs in a sense of mutuality. And it's not a place where there's no conflict at the end. It's a place where our conflicts are engaged creatively and productively to the extent possible. So in looking at reconciliation processes in many parts of the world, we were able, through another group of artists, not the Theater Without Borders folks, but a group called Recasting Reconciliation for Culture and the Arts from many different parts of the world, to see that there are usually like at least 7 different elements of reconciliation. So I'll lay these out for you. The first and foremost is, the basic is rehumanizing ourselves and each other. And here are images of, up in the upper right-hand corner, Hutu and Tutsi young people from Burundi who were who are drumming together. And through many years of violence, they privileged their identity as drummers over being Hutus and Tutsis, and repeatedly saved each other's lives. And it was in seeing themselves as drummers, as musicians, as artists, that they maintained a sense of each other's humanity when everything around them was telling them that the other was less than human. The need for rehumanization is critically important because when we inflict violence on another party, on another person, it's just in human nature to dehumanize that person. And conversely, when a group or a person is dehumanized, we become able then to inflict violence on them. So the rehumanization of the other is a really important part of disrupting that cycle of violence and revenge. The other slides here are of a reconciliation, of a performance at the Rwandan, at the 10th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. It was an opera in which this young boy is saying, look, I see that our blood is the same color. Hutu blood, Tutsi blood, it's the same color. Okay, move to the next slide. Next thing that almost always goes on in processes of reconciliation is listening to and telling stories and increasing the complexity of the stories that we tell. In context of violence, many of you here I'm sure can attest to this, the stories that are told become very narrow and thin. And there's one group story and the other group story, and you sort of feel compelled, if you're a member of that community in a time of violence, to stick to that narrative. Like, we're going to stick together, and this is the story we have of our history, this is the story that we have of our suffering. And what happens when we begin to listen to each other's stories is our own stories become more complex. We realize that the narrative that we've learned, that we've been told, is tempered by and shaped by another narrative. In working with young people from the island of Cyprus, where there's a division between the Greeks and the Turkish people, we asked them to make timelines that they could put along the floor, and walking between these timelines, the Greek story on one side and the Turkish story on the other side, people for the first time recognized that young people recognized that, in fact, they had been lied to by their teachers. I mean, that the teachers only gave them one side of the story. And that in order to understand, let's say, what it means for me to be a white American woman, I also have to understand the African American experience, the Native American experience. You can't really understand the meaning of your own community's narrative unless it bumps up against and is informed by the narratives of the other communities that you're around. So I would say it's even just for our own integrity as ethical beings in the world that we need to be listening to and seeking out the stories of the others whose lives are around our own. The young people in a refugee camp in Ghana who had come from Liberia, from different ethnic communities, learning to listen to each other's stories and tell stories through hip-hop, through rap. There's a lot of hip-hop and rap, hip-hop theater and hip-hop culture creating communities among young people all over the world, we've discovered. In Palestine and Israel and Australia and Africa and Sri Lanka, in Cambodia. And then there's also playback theater, which is a form of community theater probably many of you know. These are scenes in an Angola refugee camp and then also in New Orleans after Katrina. People performing in a mode of improvisational theater in which listening is at the core and the ability to reenact the essence of a story that has been heard. The training for being in playback theater is an amazing training in listening. And I don't know how much playback is happening in Northern Ireland, if it is, but maybe to come. Okay, so rehumanizing the other and listening to stories. The next slide is about mourning losses. These are two images from an exhibition in Cambodia called The Legacy of Absence, in which artists from all artists in the country were invited to share images from the legacy of the Khmer Rouge genocide. I'm in a small gallery at the Rayum Institute for Art and Culture. Mourning losses is such an important element of reconciliation because addressing injustices and seeking justice. So some people say, well, are you for justice or reconciliation? And in this framework, I would say it's impossible to have any kind of reconciliation that does not also address injustices. And the arts can be used in many different ways to help people acknowledge injustice and to begin to work the long journey towards some sort of justice, even if it's not like a fully satisfying justice. In many cases, reconciliation requires an acceptance of symbolic or partial justice, perhaps. I put in this image of Yuachkani on this slide because I feel that, this performance that you saw of Rosa Cachillo that you saw in the little trailer, one of the parts of the story is that this core of the story is that Rosa Cachillo has lost a son who was disappeared by the government in the time of the Civil War. And Rosa Cachillo goes into the afterworld to search for her son. There in the afterworld, after struggling and encountering many dangers, she does find her son he emerges from the heart of a god in the underworld in a beacon of light. And she's able to hug him and say goodbye. And I think that there's a quality of justice in that could never be matched in any courtroom. That you have the chance to vicariously, poetically, artistically, to embrace the son who has disappeared. And the other image here is actually from District 6 Museum in Cape Town, in which oral histories and stories were gathered of the people who were dislocated from a particular tract in the town. And these images, the family photos and the stories, were actually used as part of a scheme to document that people had lived there, so that they were able to be included in a reparations scheme. So I don't think reconciliation necessarily requires forgiveness, but it does require some kind of letting go of bitterness, some way of including those who have been alienated, those from who we've shunned, who we've seen as enemy, as other, to bring them back into the community of human caring. That's what I would think about as a way of understanding what letting go of bitterness is. And when forgiveness is possible, it's very efficient in a certain way. I mean, one person can apologize, thereby acknowledging that what they did was wrong. The other person can accept their apology and perhaps forgive, acknowledging also that what they did was wrong and that they're going to be able to move forward into the future. But there are other aspects, other ways to think about letting go of bitterness, and this is one example of a work that is undertaken by a group in Chile called Casa Grande. And the particular project here is one that took place in Guernica in Spain, which was, of course, the first city that was ever bombed by planes from the air. So to prepare this community of Guernica for this ritual, a lot of oral histories were conducted and poetry writing workshops, and then on the anniversary of the first bombing ever of a city from the air, a plane was hired and came across this plaza at night. And what you see here is being dropped from the plane, poems coming down in paper. And the children and the grandchildren of the people who experienced these bombs were reaching up in the air for poems. So it's like replacing that horrible image of destruction with images of creativity and experience of creativity. Next slide. And I also, after being here, wanted to share with you another example of letting go of bitterness, which is an installation of artwork created by actually a friend of mine, a Chinese-American man named Wen Ting Sen, who worked in Washington State in the United States, where you had a mixture of European descended people, Mexican Americans, African Americans, Japanese Americans who had been interned in camps during World War II. And he worked with the community and created murals and gathered stories and created a plaza in a parking lot that was on the border between the Mexican American and the Anglo-American part of town. And it includes elements, stories from Native American people, and the ring you see around the top at night is actually a neon ring, and it sort of pulses in colors to the traditional beat of the powwow of the Yakama Nation. And these arms, the cement arms that you see along the side, have 30 or so windows in each one, and each one has sort of a craft or an art or something from local people. And then he also took stories and built sculptures of the work of the region, apple picking and sewing and that sort of thing. And he thinks of this as a forgiving space where everyone's history is acknowledged in some way, and people can come and enter, and there's actually water that flows through the space as a healing element. He did this work as it was part of the bicentennial, and it was in this space where this community gathered. Oh no, the turn of the millennium actually, it was in 2000, and it was in this space that the community gathered after 2011, 9/11, to come together. So again, it's a way of, for this community which harbored huge resentments, economically based primarily, ethnically based, to create a space where people could let go of that bitterness and come together. Last element of this is imagining a new future. Next slide. Yeah, next slide. Okay. And this work is, you see here is a mural of one of our colleagues, Claudia Bernardi. I don't know if Claudia's come here to Derry Playhouse yet, but... Yes. This is beautiful mural-making work that she did in El Salvador with communities that have survived massacres, and people chose to mark the space, to memorialize the space in a sense, with visions of the future that they wanted to create together. And it was in this process of decision-making about what goes in the mural and how we're going to paint it that a lot of rebuilding of community was done in creating the relationships that would allow people to go into the future. And I want to mention also in the upper corner here, this is a scene from Australia in which Aboriginal people are there with the Prime Minister. And as you might know, like in Australia, there was actually a formal government apology of many of the harms that were done. And I actually want to play you the story of that being told by a colleague of ours in the Acting Together project, Polly Walker, who herself is Native American, but she's been working with both Native American and Indigenous peoples ritual in Australia. So why don't we play this second clip? It's about 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll finish up.
I grew up Cherokee of mixed descent on a ranch in a wilderness area in New Mexico. I heard stories from the elders there of the profound healing that came about for them of returning to the traditions. And I saw that echoed time and time again in Cherokee ceremonies that I was in and others. And I knew at this really implicit level there was something quite important going on. Ritual and ceremony embody intellectual aspects of human experience, emotional aspects, spiritual aspects, and connection with the natural world. And I think that it's the bringing together of all of those elements, a performance, a singing up, as you will, of all these different aspects that are quite often silenced. So finding ways around that just exoticizing of the other, or the exoticizing of indigenous ceremony, and finding ways to invite people in ways where they can form new kinships rather than being an other or an observer. In Australia, I had the opportunity to be involved in a series of reconciliation ceremonies. The first one was with a friend of mine named Flo Watson, who's of the Sunset Ulanji people, and she was one of the stolen generations. And in Australia, it was official government policy until about 1976 to remove Aboriginal children from their parents for a whole range of reasons. I was at her home when the Lord Mayor sent around some representatives, and she said, oh, we're going to have these reconciliation ceremonies on the sites of the children's homes where we were raised when we were taken away from our families. And then I went with her to that first ceremony, and she stood up and told her story.
My own personal experience, my mum was part of the stolen generation. She was taken away at the age of 5, and Mum used to tell me when she was taken, they were all sitting on the Palmer River and all dancing and laughing and singing, and the troopers came in and actually rounded them all together, or 9 of them, and when they took the 4 of them, my mum's youngest brother was being grabbed by one of the troopers, and there were black and white troopers at that time. The white troopers trained the black troopers how to do it all. And my grandmother was shot and killed, so that must have been pretty hard for my mum to see, because she was shot in her right leg because she tried to rescue her little brother. So that's a bit emotional for me.
In this whole gathering of white Australians and Aboriginal Australians, Flo told her story of what it was like for her to be taken away from her family, and of course there were tears and they were grieving. And there was Aboriginal smoking ceremony where people were cleansed of hurt by the smoke of gum leaves. There was Aboriginal dancing, didgeridoo music, clap sticks, and also then words of apology by the Lord Mayor and other city officials. And after that, Flo said to me, she said, you know, that day was the beginning of my healing. To see both white fellows and Aboriginal peoples come together on that place where so much pain happened, and to know that they heard my stories that had never been heard before with respect, and that they listened with respect, and they were respectful of our ways of being. She said, I know I have more healing to do, but that was a real turning point, and I began to heal. You'll quite often hear people say when discussion of Indigenous issues comes up, well, that was so far in the past, let's just leave it behind and let's move on. That's the way towards reconciliation. But for people whose time cosmologies are circular, those things don't change until indeed something's been done to address them, something's been done to heal them. And again, drawing on traditions, that was done through ceremonies. And it seems that over these number of years that these rituals have been occurring, this has built a foundation for national processes of reconciliation. For example, the 2008 ceremonies in Parliament that accompanied the Prime Minister's official apology to the stolen generations.
Prime Minister, my grandchildren have handed you a gift, a message stick, a tangible symbol of today's ceremony. The message stick is a means of communication used by our peoples for thousands of years. They tell the story of our coming together. Thank you very much and welcome to the land of our ancestors.
Cultures in human history. We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments, for the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants, and for their families left behind, we say sorry. And for the indignity and degradation thus inflicted on a proud people and a proud culture, we say sorry. For the future, we take heart, resolving that this new page in the history of our great continent can now be written.
One thing we know about reconciliation, it's an ongoing process, right? It doesn't end. It's like the search for truth. You can go more deeply and more deeply and more deeply. It doesn't end. And I think that's reconciliation has that same sort of quality. It's ongoing infinitely, kind of, that we can build more honest, more relationships with each other. Yeah, I think that I just wanted to pick up on one thing that Bonita said, which is that there are all different kinds of performances. There's ritual, in which everyone is a participant. There's community-based performances in which community people are playing themselves, or like playback theater or theater of the oppressed. And there's artist-based theater. And I think we can see that all of them can contribute in very significant and important ways to process of peace building and reconciliation. And that one of the important bridges to cross here is like that people involved in all these different forms of theater or performance can also begin to work together. And also, like here in the story that Polly told about the reconciliation process in Australia, which sort of built up from many local community rituals to a more national consciousness that built enough knowledge and relationships and understanding that there could be even a national apology, that people would receive that apology, even though mistakes were made, and even though certainly there's many, many, many problems and many skeptics about that process. Very often what makes peace-building performances most effective is collaborations with non-arts organizations, in this case actually the legislature. That by connecting with human rights organizations or community development organizations, women's organizations, in the case of Peru it was with the Truth Commission. The work that artists do can be amplified and brought out into the community, and the responsibility for that amplification, for those collaborations, doesn't rest only with the artists. It rests also with the activists, the educators, the political leaders, to think together about how we can take all this really powerful work that's happening in the transformative space of the arts and leverage it out to change in the communities. So I think that could be a good place to stop for the morning. Thank you.